Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Scott, talking to you from Oxford in the UK, and I'm welcoming you to our Christian Literary Imagination Series 2. This is the third event this academic year in the second series of the Christian Literary Imagination, which is a Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Today, Joseph Simmons, SJ, from Campion Hall, will be introducing John Fordresher from Georgetown, although he happens to be in Florence, the lucky man at the moment. And he'll be talking about Robert Browning's poem, Christmas Eve. After his talk, Professor Fordresher will take questions submitted from members of our internationally based audience. We encourage you, please, to participate by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. You can do so by using your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or questions, please ask them, and we will endeavour to answer them either today or later by email. So that's enough from me in introducing the event. I'm going to now hand over to Joseph Simmons. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being here today. Greetings from Campion Hall, the Jesuit bastion here in Oxford, England. Here in Oxford, you'll find many high cheekbone professors and bearded mouths composing intent, evocative of some of the lines we'll hear in today's poem that John will be reflecting on. We're pleased to have John Fordresher coming to us, as Michael said, live from Florence. John is an emeritus professor of English at Georgetown University, where he taught from 1973 until June 2020, with special interest in 19th century literature, Anglophone writers in Italy, and Catholic studies. For many years, John offered courses in the Catholic imagination to undergraduates, and in 2008, he published his book, Jesus and the Emergence of a Catholic Imagination, an Illustrated History. His latest book, The Secret History of Jane Eyre, How Charlotte Bronte Wrote Her Masterpiece, was published in 2017. And John, if there's anything more recent than that, I look forward to you correcting me on that. And as Michael said, today's fascinating paper is entitled Grotesque Christian Realism in Robert Browning's Christmas Eve. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get to the other half, Easter Day, but I'm sure John will be touching on that at least at the beginning. A reminder to all of you following at home that you can send your questions in through the chat function below down here, which I will sort through along with Catherine Temple, and then we will ask John the questions that you may have. So without further ado, John Fordresher, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much to everybody. This presentation on Robert Browning's Christmas Eve and Easter Day, as a version of 19th century Christian grotesque, seeks to fit a largely ignored poem into a long and complex tradition, stretching from the dream of the Rood and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to the Wasteland and Wise Blood. Browning's 142-page poem, Christmas Eve and Easter Day, in rhyming tetrameter lines, was published April 1st, 1850. Its title suggests this ought to be a poetic project. As interpretive resources, I will be using two important discussions of the grotesque, which were published after Browning's poem. The third volume of John Ruskin's Stones of Venice, which appeared in 1853, and Walter Bagehot's journal article on Wordsworth, Tennyson, and Browning, which appeared in 1864. First, some initiating events. Browning's youthful Christian beliefs had been guided by his mother, who took him every Sunday to the independent congregation which met in York Street, Walworth. But from their elopement in 1846, he had lived with Elizabeth Barrett in Italy. So he was grieved at not being able to return to England to be at his mother's deathbed in March of 1849. It's reasonable to imagine that Browning found himself thinking about what Badger calls his mother's God in the ensuing months. Such ruminations were coupled with Elizabeth Barrett Browning's own strongly expressed wish that he should write a long moral and religious poem addressing himself to the reader as R.B. a poem. But Browning did not wish to write this kind of poem. His Pauline, a personal confessional utterance and his first work to be published, had been savaged by critics and in later years caused him exquisite embarrassment. As an alternative mode of writing, as Philip Drew puts it, Browning's characteristic approach to an ethical problem came to be dramatizing that problem within the experience of a single character in the form of a monologue. Indeed, Browning's preferred form is the disputation. So instead of a highly personal religious confession, Browning decided to invent a pair of disputatious speakers who would narrate their experiences of the two central Christian festivals. And their preferred way of voicing their stories would be the grotesque. Bagehot's essay, using this term, points out that Browning's manner of writing deals not with normal types, but with abnormal specimens. Hence, it makes you see the perfect type by painting the opposite deviation. For Bagehot, Mr. Browning is an artist working by incongruity. He puts together things which no one else would have put together and produces on our minds a result which no one else would have produced or tried to produce. This putting together is the essential characteristic of grotesque imagery. As Dorothea Schull points out, right from the beginning of the discovery of grotesque decoration in the Domus Aurea in Rome, during the last decades of the 15th century, the question of sense was the most challenging and was expressed by a vocabulary focusing on the capricious, the enigmatic, the strange, bizarre, chimeric, monstrous, and extravagant, evoking an enigmatic, dreamlike universe full of mysteries. Bagehot was to point out the consequence of Browning's bizarre coupling of the sacred and the utmost uncouthness of external form is that good elements are hidden in horrid accompaniments. And this became for Browning the special theme of grotesque art. As Bagehot puts it, Mr. Browning evidently loves what we may call the realism, the grotesque realism of Orthodox Christianity. This brings us back to the death of Browning's mother. Ruskin argues the grotesque arises out of that condition of mind which appears to follow naturally upon the contemplation of death, and in which the fancy is brought into morbid action by terror, accompanied by the belief in spiritual presence and in the possibility of spiritual apparition. This, in turn, may have led Browning to his choice of genre. And so now we move from the grotesque to the genre of the dream vision, a genre most importantly represented by an earlier instance of another lonely speaker confronting death, Dante's Commedia. Ruskin stressed the irrational character of this narrative form, which both Dante and Browning adopt. Here's Ruskin. The noblest forms of imaginative power are in some sort ungovernable and have in them something of the character of a dream, so that the vision of whatever kind comes uncalled and will not submit itself to the seer, but conquers him and forces him to speak as a prophet, having no power over his words or thoughts. We find all these traits in Browning's poem. The visionary experience of Browning's Christmas Eve is set on that festival day. But just as with Dickens' A Christmas Carol, another dream vision, which appeared in December of 1843, Browning's poem makes no mention of Bethlehem, the manger, Mary and Joseph, the birth of the saviors, angels singing to shepherds, and so on. Dickens' book enjoyed an amazing success precisely because it celebrates a post-Christ Christmas. jollity, charity, and kindness towards others, but without the specific celebration of the birth of Jesus. Browning's poem returns to this issue, but through its own idiosyncratic processes. Now I would like to summarize what happens in his Christmas Eve, and then to assess the tale he tells and the means he uses to tell it, to understand how it is intended to be a specifically Christian work of imagination. Browning's poem begins with its verbally uncouth speaker dodging the cold rain of a Christmas Eve and entering into a dissenting chapel in a British Midlands town. Made uncomfortable both by the people gathered there and by what he considers the foolishness of the sermon they are listening to, he leaves. The rain has stopped, and climbing a hill, he witnesses an amazing natural phenomenon, a twin moon rainbow. And in its luster, he suddenly sees the figure of Jesus, who has also just left the dissenters' chapel. Jesus has his back turned to the speaker, who has only the sight of a sweepy garment, vast and white, with a hem that I could recognize. The speaker cries out to Jesus, who turns and in looking at him makes him saturate with brightness. And then the speaker finds himself in the swirl of the white garment. As Jesus moves forward, he grabs the garment's hem. And as if sucked along in the flying wake of the luminous water snake, the bizarre metaphor Browning's speaker uses, he is transported to the piazza in front of St. Peter's in Rome and its Bernini columns. The speaker refuses to enter this famous basilica, claiming his eye penetrates the outer wall and he can see the view inside. Acknowledging that Christ has joined his second congregation as well, the speaker is soon aware that Christ is leaving, and he finds himself again sucked along into the flying wake of the luminous water snake and carried to the doorway of a lecture hall in Göttingen, Germany. Inside, a crowd of students wait to hear a celebrated professor, famed for his work in deconstructing this myth of Christ, which he will summarize as his Christmas Eve lecture. The speaker, still clutching the hem of Christ's garment, realizes he may leave this scene too, and finds himself suddenly back in the dissenters' chapel in England. The congregation seem offended by him. Has he been dozing off? Has the entire experience, which the poem has narrated, actually been a dream? Embarrassed, he looks back at them and then seizing a hymnal joins them singing, Browning's poem ending with the line, to conclude with the doxology. Let's now look at the component parts of this dream vision and consider how Browning is first using the grotesque to articulate a critique of the current modes of Christianity in Europe. And secondly, at the same time, let's look at how he works to develop his own version of a Christian imagination. The structure of Browning's narrative, like Dante's Commedia, uses three individuated places. Whereas with Dante, they are the realms of hell, purgatory, and heaven, with Browning, they are three interiors. For Browning, each emerge from the historical tradition of the Roman grotto in the sense that inside each enclosed place, there is a cluster of grotesque images, both persons and aspects of the place itself. In every instance, he is developing a critique of practices in the Christianity of 1850. So now, let's look at the grottos, the people who are inside them, the religious leaders who are performing on this Christmas Eve, and the guide who leads Browning's speaker, and how this guide comes to embody the poem's innovative Christian imagination for the future. The grottos, the dissenters' chapel, Fleeing the cold rain of this Christmas Eve, the speaker finds himself in a lath and plaster entryway with a squeaky door. Indeed, the chapel is defined by its inexpensive, whitewashed face. Inside, the small cluster of believers strike him as forms burlesque, uncouth. But the speaker must concede that this congregation, these ruins of humanity, take comfort from their time there. At St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the speaker suddenly finds himself confronted by the famous Bernini colonnade and says, with arms wide open to embrace the entry of the human race to the breast of yon building, ablaze in front, all paint and gilding. The cheap honesty of the Dissenters' Chapel has been replaced here by the lavish dishonesty of Roman Catholic splendor and wealth, the paint and gilding, with, as the speaker puts it, marble for brick and stones of price for garniture of the edifice. Crucial to this grotesque description is the obvious suggestion that the colonnade and facade of the church are like a woman's body, arms and breast, tricked out with expensive yet cheap-looking cosmetics in an effort to make it attractive. Whereas the speaker entered the Dissenters' Chapel, here Christ will not bid me enter too, but rather sit as now I do, and awaiting his return outside. A dissenting alien, the speaker never enters St. Peter's. When Christ has transported the speaker to Germany, he sits on the stairs leading to a university lecture hall, peeping in through the entrance door. Again, he is the alien, the outsider. The place seems to him a sort of temple, and as he peers in, he continues clinging to the vesture's hem. So here we have three Christian communities. In the Dissenters' Chapel, Browning uses what Bagehot has called the grotesque realism of Orthodox Christianity. And so here are the ways Browning's poem describes some of the faithful. The fat, weary woman, panting and bewildered, down clapping her umbrella with a mighty report. And then a many tattered little old-faced peeking sister-turned mother of the sickly babe she tried to smother somehow up on her breast, the one warm place. And then a female something with lips as much too white as a streak lay far too red on each hollow cheek. And a tall yellow man like the penitent thief with his jaw bound up in a handkerchief. And finally, a shoemaker's lad with wizened face in want of soap and wet apron wound around his waist like a rope after stopping outside for his cough was bad, to get the fit over, poor gentle creature, and so to avoid disturbing the preacher. These forms, burlesque and uncouth, given in highly specific descriptions, tell us of a community of people with very little money. The prostitute, the tubercular apprentice, the child mother, tell us of difficult lives, of privation, and of the open acceptance given to them at the chapel and its comfort for them. Bagehot's important point that Browning's abnormal specimens serve to suggest the perfect type help us to understand that the community he grew up in York Street, Walworth, was in some ways like this. And the structures of need and desperation may have been there as well. At St. Peter's, while the speaker sees individuals in England, in Italy, he sits outside, believing that somehow he sees the view inside and imagines all the faithful are actually like bees. The swarming hollow of a hive, the whole basilica alive. He sees only a mindless mass. Men in the chancel, body and nave, men on the pillars, architrave, men on the statues, men on the tombs with popes and kings in their porphyry tombs. all famishing in expectation of the main altar's consummation. And so he then describes the upward ascending ecstasy of the consecration, a rapturous moment when heaven breaks through to earth and Christ will be welcomed by music which sounds to him like hog grunts and horses neighing. And the voracious Romans will be fed as a babe can find its mother's breast as well in darkness as in light. Roman Christianity offers a very different consolation from what is found in the Dissenters' Chapel. Notably, there's no sermon, no leading figure to articulate an understanding of what Christmas Eve might mean, but only an animalistic feeding. The bees, the dogs, the horses, the children avidly sucking at the maternal breast without question or understanding, nothing but eager satiation. At the lecture hall in Göttingen, the passage picturing the hall gives a single glimpse of the students, each bearded mouth composed, intent. The speaker, who perhaps cannot actually see most of them, presumes a devoted, unquestioning eagerness to hear the famous lecturer. There's no individuality here at all, just men's bearded mouths waiting. And then the religious leaders. The dissenting preacher is pictured by Browning as a self-taught, perhaps a self-validating individual, caught up in a personal prophetic vision of Christianity, and on this Christmas Eve, preaching to his docile and receptive community his new insights. Indeed, as the speaker puts it, no sooner had our friend got an inkling of treasure hidden in the Holy Bible than he handled it so in fine irreverence as to hug the book to pieces. And a patchwork of chapters and texts in severance, having clothed his own soul with, he'd fain see equipped yours, so tossed you again your holy scriptures. This marvelous grotesque, the preacher, dressed in pages from the Bible he's torn out, with a vision which he now tries to impose on his followers, doesn't satisfy the speaker, who flees after about 5 minutes, and later, walking outside, recalls the sermon as a mingled weft of good and ill. And for Roman Catholics, Browning names no individual leaders in St. Peter's scene, just that mass of people where filthy saints, his words, had once hurled from the throne all earlier pagan achievements of intellect and art. For the professor in Göttingen, while he doesn't even seem to see the students, the speaker is able to lavish an extended description. The professor, quote, because of his cranium's over freight, 3 parts sublime and 1 grotesque, martyr to mild enthusiasm, with a wan, pure look, well nigh celestial, those blue eyes had survived so much. During his Christmas Eve discourse, he will take apart this myth of Christ, stripping away the teaching authority of Jesus, leaving him simply a remarkable man, as Shakespeare was a remarkable writer, a conclusion Browning's speaker abruptly rejects. This survey of grottos and grotesques has already made clear that the oddest aspect of Browning's Christmas Eve is its presentation of Jesus himself, who is the guide. While the holiday is celebrating his birth in Bethlehem, the poem presents Christ as the guide who is leading the speaker through his dream vision. But this guide is far from the figure found in the 4 Gospels and quite different from his predecessors in Dante and Dickens. Throughout the first 2 parts of the Commedia, Virgil touches Dante, picks him up when he faints, dries his tears, and explains at great length what they are witnessing. The Spirit of Christmas Past greets Dickens' Scrooge this way. It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm. And Dickens' first 2 spirits speak at length about the meaning of each of their dream visions, Browning's Christ never touches him, never says a word. First seen in a burst of moonlight illuminating the poem's speaker, he begins a course of swift movement which takes him to the various sites pictured by the poem. The speaker snatches at Christ's sweepy garment, vast and white, with a hem that I could recognize. This bizarre detail is a conscious echo on Browning's part of Matthew 9:20. When a woman, which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years, touched the hem of Christ's garment. The word Browning uses, hem, comes from this King James translation. And when Jesus, sensing her touch, turns to her, he says, "Thy faith has made thee whole." The contrasting silence of Browning's Jesus, notice in the gospel, Jesus is talking all the time, Browning's silent Jesus, and the constantly repeating adjective white, which never appears in the gospels, leads to this strange gender reverse, where a seeming male speaker, not suffering from an issue of blood, enacts his faith through snatching and clutching the hem. And it is this talisman which leads him into the journey of the dream vision. While this Christ remains silent, the speaker frequently recalls and echoes what Jesus says in the scriptures. And crucial for Browning's narrative purpose is the moment when he remembers Jesus' proclamation in Matthew, "When 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them." Though the speaker is eager to discount the value of the dissenting minister's sermon, the ritual ecstasies of the sensuous Romans, the coldly analytic mind of the German professor, remembering the saying of Jesus forces him to acknowledge that somehow or other, Christ is in all of these places and with all of these people on Christmas Eve, which is to suggest that Christianity itself is a far more strangely diverse and living thing than the speaker himself wishes to acknowledge. And so now we come to him. The speaker has become Ruskin's, remember the description of the dream vision as a genre, Ruskin's involuntary witness prophet, terrified by death, led through a series of nightmare dream visions by a spiritual presence. It's all Ruskin's language, it's all Browning's poem. Browning's speaker reaches these conclusions. First, of his relationship to Jesus, quote, "He suffers me to follow him forever my own way." He asserts, "I have my own church equally, and in this church, my faith sprang first." Fleeing the dissenter's chapel, he feels a burst of rain on my face and a glad rebound from the heart beneath, as if God speeding me, I entered his church door, nature leading me. I hope you get that. The church door of the speaker's God is nature and not any building, not any of the 3 grottos we've seen. And he continues, "In youth, I looked at these very skies, and probing their immensities, I found God there, his visible power, yet felt in my heart that his love was there too." And so he finds his God in, quote, "this sky of thine." For others, quote, "the narrow shrine." For him, the night sky, which is, as he says, my way. The speaker rejoices in his solitude, his ability to exercise his intellect, the ways he finds God's presence and God's love in nature, and hence claims he will always be ahead of others in his pursuit of God. The ensuing second poem in Browning's book, Easter Day, will work with these topics through a torturous dialogue on Christian faith, a dialogue between voices, which is then followed by a vision of the end of the world and a further argument between this poem's speaker and a dark guide as to whether or not the speaker's love for this created world will keep him out of paradise. That poem ending, I find it hard to be a Christian. But with that brief epilogue, I want to thank everybody for listening to me. Joseph, thanks for being here, and I think we're ready for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John.
Welcome.
Just put my earbuds in here so I can properly ask questions. We have a number of questions, and I invite all of you to drop them into the Q&A below if you'd like to ask questions of John. The first question comes from Angela Preston, who asks, despite Elizabeth Barrett Browning's insistence to write the poem, Christmas Eve mentions the word men over 50 times, but women 5 times. And some of the
we're not exactly flattering calling women fat, for example. So the question, I guess, is there a way to reconcile these unflattering representations with the celebration of Christmas? Was the gist of her question.
It's a difficult problem, really, isn't it? I mean, her tabulation of the number of references suggests very much a male focus. The students in Göttingen would have been, of course, all men, but the description of St. Peter's with that funny passage, it sounds like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, of men everywhere, and no women at all. I keep wondering if there aren't some Roman women in St. Peter's on Christmas Eve. And when we do see women, such as the fat woman in the Dissenters' chapel, or the prostitute, or the little girl who's holding the baby to her breast, those are at best unhappy and very dark references. What can I say? The questioner knows that Browning was extraordinarily admiring of Elizabeth Barrett from the moment he first read her poems. He was very much the devoted enthusiast of all her work and supporter of all her work. And during most of their shared lives together, she was the famous poet and he was the oddball. And so he certainly was not anti-feminist in his own life or his practice as a writer or a sort of man of the literary profession. But there we are at what she pointed out. Yeah. Maybe I would want to just elaborate here. The speaker is clearly not an ideal character. One of the points that I try to make is he is eager to misjudge all the other Christians he sees. He's eager to affirm his alienation, his independence, his own version of the Christian vision, which is very much a solitary one. And then there's that strange way in which he's turned himself into the woman with the issue of blood. And I frankly, I cannot explain that at all. Maybe we'll have some more questions about that.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking just about this kind of how he reacts or interacts with the people in the Dissenters' Chapel. And it put me in mind of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where he talks about if you take sort of the learned man who's interested, the learned person who's interested in becoming Christian, to put them in the chapel and imagine looking around with certain scorn at the grocer or the ugly, poorly dressed person over there, as a way of kind of feeling a certain distance from them because you're better than them, because you're more educated than them. I wonder if Lewis himself might have been drawing on the poem at all and some of that imagery. Are you familiar with what I'm referring to in Screwtape Letters?
Well, it's a long time since I've read it, but I think the point is that you're making is extremely important. And insofar as Screwtape, he's the devil, right? Is eager to draw that kind of contemptuous response in the part of somebody. This is a temptation, right?
Yes.
One of the things that I've had to do in the presentation, of course, is to ruthlessly cut my references to the poem. In other words, there's a whole long further passage describing the Dissenters' Chapel, and I just didn't have time or space for that, and all kinds of other stuff.
Yes. There's another question that came up related to
Yes.
that, I suppose, had to do with sort of imagining what the hog grunts and the beehives that are heard in the Vatican. And I guess a larger question that I would have tied to that is, you described it as sort of the lavish dishonesty of Catholicism. And I think that's your way of describing that, your particular judgment on it. But I'm wondering,
It is.
do you think he's sort of offering a subtle dig at Catholicism? You did say
Oh,
that he
sure.
imagines Christ is
Not
present.
too
in each of the
subtle,
sections.
Joe. Not too
Yes.
subtle. And my wonderful colleague Anthony Del Donna pointed out that the bee thing may be consequent of the Bernini's supporting the reconstruction of St. Peter's and putting the bees all over the interior of the building as their claim to sort of be the prominent Romans who are glorifying the interior. No, my paper tries to suggest that this is a very hostile description of Roman Catholic Christianity. There are other passages, again, which I could not talk about, where the speaker goes on line after line after line, describing how the Roman Catholics inherited this rich Greco-Roman culture and proceeded to trash it all and to, in one phrase, offer it up as a kind of gift to God. In other words, they're going to give him all of that. He's an image of a statue of Venus with its nose broken by the Christians in order to prove their religious faith. And of course, for the speaker, and I think for Robert Browning, this is not a good bargain. Browning, by the way, had not been to Rome and had not seen St. Peter's when he wrote the poem. And the speaker acknowledges he'd only seen pictures of it in books.
Yes. I'm reminded too in the kind of description of imagining being able to see into St. Peter's without actually being, it seems like
Crazy, right? It's
speaking metaphorically as an outsider to the church, not really knowing what it's like on the inside. But my own work is on Virginia Woolf, and so at the risk of turning it to, what do you think about what I'm writing on? But Virginia Woolf talks about going into this core shape of darkness in her novel To the Lighthouse, which is where one kind of engages the imagination and allows them to travel wherever. She writes, this is Mrs. Ramsay in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. There were all the places she had not seen, the Indian plains. She felt herself pushing aside the thick leather curtain of a church in Rome. This core of darkness could go anywhere, for no one saw it. And I just think that's sort of an imaginative to know that he had never been there, and yet he felt somehow that he could, based on maybe some prejudices of his take on what Catholicism was, he could nevertheless see the heart of the essence of what Catholic Christianity had to offer.
Yeah. He and Elizabeth Barrett had been to services, I think, in Pisa, and of course they were living in Florence, and so familiar with the Duomo here, but never to Rome. Yeah,
certainly. Okay. We have another question from Catherine Temple, Georgetown. The thought of a poem celebrating Christmas but never invoking Christ seems sad to me. Can you talk about the relationship between the grotesque imaginary and the melancholic?
That's interesting. What I did, as you heard, was to juxtapose Dickens and to suggest that, curiously, both Dickens' Christmas Carol and Browning's Christmas Eve are not celebrating what we Americans think of as the Christmas festivities, initiated, as we know, by St. Francis in Assisi, but instead something that's very local, I like the phrase used again is of melancholy. Could you please repeat the phrase, Joe?
Sure. Catherine Temple asked, can you talk about the relationship between the grotesque, the grotesque and the melancholic, or the melancholy?
Because that's really fascinating, isn't it? Insofar as, okay, if we think for a minute of Bagehot's fascination with antithesis, that the grotesque presents this is a way of working with this question, I think. The grotesque gives us as it were, the radical opposite of what should be praised, evoked, celebrated, right? So Browning's grotesque description of Christmas Eve, devoid of the manger, the virgin, the Virgin Mother, the Christ child, the angel, in a sense, there's a kind of, if you think about it, if you stand back, which is I think what the question wants us to do, if you stand back from what Browning's speaker does and ask the question, the melancholy question, what's missing? What's the opposite? What has been scanted or passed over? There's the answer, which would be the joy of the Redeemer suddenly appearing on earth and coming to save humanity through his life and death.
Yes, kind of in the domain of theology, we often speak of, and this is drawing on phenomenology, but presence and absence. So feeling acutely the absence of God, or feeling acutely the absence of Christ on Holy Saturday is a way of making Christ present in another way. Sort of an awareness of, we feel acutely that loss, and therefore Christ is present to us in a way that we wouldn't be able to summon just by, I don't know, creating the equivalent of a Thomas Kinkade painting with Jesus right in the middle of it, some overly saccharine. And somebody did have a question here, and it might be worth clarifying. When we usually in common parlance, we speak of grotesque as kind of ugly or repugnant, and indeed that's something what you're talking about, but the term itself refers to kind of grottos and cave artwork, right? And do you want to just address that a little bit about the origin of that term for the?
Yeah, delighted. There's a very scant reference in the paper. It's a fascinating story from the start. The word and its evolution through the centuries. So in the 15th century, there were excavations in Rome, and they included the excavation of Nero's Golden House, the Domus Aurea, and within were these grottos, these sort of subterranean places where on the walls and ceiling there were these fantastic drawings or paintings of creatures who were often hybridized beasts and people, and they were clearly put there in a playful sense. So a grotesque is a picture from a grotto, and these Roman pictures discovered in Roman grottos in the Renaissance. Quickly, Raphael and his pupils were to decorate places in the Vatican with what were then for them contemporary copies or reimaginings of the grottos. And interestingly, the Uffizi down the street from us has its corridor ceilings filled with pretend grotesque decorations for the Medicis, because this was thought to be great, thought to be classy and stylish. But as time passed, and actually this could be the subject of a whole semester's worth of talk between us, as time passed, the word came to mean exaggerated, ugly, twisted. As I was working on the paper, I kept thinking of those famous drawings by Leonardo of people he saw on the street. And he drew old men, and they're quite ugly faces. They're faces that we would think of as grotesque, but for Leonardo were simply fascinating versions of what the human face would look like. By the 18th century, the word had become distinctly polarized and negative, right? And it certainly was in the 19th century as well. And if you look at art history narratives, they will trace that whole history. What happens, of course, in the 20th century becomes extremely important. Graham Greene, obviously, Flannery O'Connor, obviously, that the grotesque becomes an area of fascinated scrutiny on the part of 20th century people. All you have to do is think of Wise Blood, or the power and the glory, to know how this feeds into Christian writing in the 20th century.
Certainly, yeah. I think my mind immediately went to Flannery O'Connor and Good Man is Hard to Find, or the Temple of the Holy Spirit, where
Yes.
that's where I think where they went to the carnival and to see these people who are physically not beautiful, and yet recognizing that these two are temples of the Holy Spirit. So it's finding that and speaking in kind of shocking, arresting images in order to draw attention to there is something more at play here.
Mhm.
That's an interesting question here. Do you find his poems to be more meditations or disputations? And then, as a follow up to that, what do you think is meant by grotesque realism in Orthodox Christianity
Yeah,
in the context of these meditations and disputations?
that is so provocative, isn't it? That phrase, that Bagehot's phrase. Working on this project for all of you, I have been reading pretty widely in Browning's writing about these issues, spanning from this poem, which is fairly early in his project, through the poems in Men and Women and later poems, to the extraordinary chapter or book in The Ring in the Book called The Pope. Browning's characteristic way of writing is disputatious. I think Drew's right. He establishes opposing points of view, which then contend in the poem itself. One of the reasons that Easter Day is so difficult to read is it's about how can you believe in God. And that's debated between two voices, back and forth and back and forth. One premise torn apart, another premise torn apart. And the reader must read very carefully and very thoughtfully. When you get to the Pope in The Ring in the Book, it's the same thing, even though it's one voice. And he's trying to work through to try and find the truth about this famous Roman murder, which he has to adjudicate. Browning's mind is so able, elastic, and as it were, capable of seeing two sides of an issue, that he demands that the reader be attentive to the dispute. And I think, I don't know how many of you, Joe or other folks have read, there's an extraordinarily funny poem called Bishop Blurham's Apology, in which a well-paid, well-fed, well-wined Roman Catholic bishop sits in London with a non-believing journalist and debates with the journalist whether his choice of being a believer or the journalist's choice of being a doubter is the more prudent. Runs on for about 15 pages. It's very, very funny. And again, it's an exercise in intellectual gymnastics. It's really marvelous.
Thank you for the recommendation. And Blurham is spelled Blougram. I learned from Google. I've not read it, but I'll take a look at it after this. That kind of reminds me.
Funny. It's very, very funny. I think you'll have a good laugh.
There's a line in the second voice from Easter Day saying, "You must mix some uncertainty with faith if you would have faith too." So sort of that dialectic or dialogic process whereby we, to say I have faith, that requires engagement with something other than faith. Do you think Browning himself, apart from a question, one of the questioner asks, notwithstanding his period of atheism influenced by Percy Bysshe Shelley, do you think that Browning had ever truly questioned his faith from the outside of it, as in from a position of atheism, or was he only doing that from within a Christian background or upbringing? Do you have any indication of that?
My sense, and I'm not a Browning expert, but so apologies, preface this comment. My sense is that the second half of his life, particularly after Elizabeth Barrett Browning's death, was always a struggle to affirm the presence of God, hope for afterlife, and doubt. That what you said a moment ago, Joseph, seems to me hugely important, and that's the way in which the dialectic of faith and doubt can actually help to build faith, but by building it through struggle, right? And one of the funny things that happened to Browning at the end of his life is that devoted readers decided to sort of christen him as the great spokesperson for Christianity, which he found extremely uncomfortable. And they would snatch lines out of his poems and celebrate them as Browning, the triumphant voice of Christian belief, which, when he didn't think of himself that way at all, I don't believe. And I think his life, his inner life, remained a dialectical struggle to the end. I think it is. He is buried in Westminster Abbey next to Tennyson, so he made it into the Abbey at the end.
Do you think there's something of these maybe kind of liminal figures who push the edges out and might have been deemed controversial, and then only later it sort of moved towards the center of the canon? I think of Graham Greene as well as somebody who struggled mightily against his own Catholic faith and was doubting it. And yet now I think most people, even more traditional Catholics, would say, "Oh, this is a great writer. We have, he's essential to the canon." So, is there something about time that kind of brings someone who might have been on the edges or peripheral closer to the center? Do you think there's something in that?
Yeah, I do. I think you're absolutely right about that. And I do think, I know as a 20th century reader, now we're in the 21st, but as a kid, when I was reading Browning, the doubt, the challenge to me was much more important than the affirmation, and later on something different. My darling mother used to love to go around on a sunny day and say, "God's in the heaven, all's right with the world," which is a line from Pippa Passes, which a naive working class girl says while two murderers plan to kill her.
Oh.
So talk about an ironic framing.
Grotesque, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Not uncommon for Browning.
Mm-hmm. One question here that's interesting, referring to, you talked about the passage of the woman with the hemorrhage who reached out to Jesus.
Yeah.
The questioner asks, the reference to the passage of the woman who bled and dared to touch Jesus's hem shows a great compassion from Jesus. Do you think Browning, relating to our earlier question, was hoping for some compassion from the church?
Well, I think that the writer's absolutely right about the hoping for compassion. And I think that that's a wonderful way of reading Browning's poem when it uses the hem, right? He grabs onto the hem in a kind of desperation, and then is carried away by Jesus as the guide. And so there's a great deal of consolation in thinking that Jesus, as the silent guide, is going to carry him along. And if I can elaborate on that just briefly, Joe, insofar as the Jesus of this poem, it doesn't speak and tries to provoke the human speaker to remember passages of scripture, there's a kind of dialectic going on right there. Is Jesus is not the extraordinary figure of that gospel passage who turns to the woman and, with, I imagine, a great deal of tenderness and respect, says to her, "Your faith has saved you. Your faith, not I, your faith has saved you." And that same hem is what the speaker in the Browning poem is hanging on to.
That's a remarkable insight. I have one more question. There are others, and we'll be able to get to those maybe via email, but this is from Claire Broom Saunders, who joins us. She says, "Thank you so much, John. Your talk has made me think about how different Browning's Christmas Eve is from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's The Virgin Mary to the Child Jesus, which of course answers all our demands for both a female voice and a meditation on the actual nativity. Do you have any sense of these two poems, his and hers, working in a kind of dialogue of absences, filling absence or deliberately creating absence?" Thank you.
Now, she's catching me in my ignorance, and I want to thank her for naming the poem by Elizabeth Barrett, because I want to read that. I do not know that poem. I think it's fascinating. It's fascinating to think of the two who were so close, engaged in this kind of dialogue as writers. Here's mine. Let me read yours, and seeing what then would emerge. That's a marvelous idea.
No, thank you, Claire, for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah.
Yeah, is there anything else you'd like to say? Otherwise, we're going to have to hand it back over to Michael. But this has been a very robust conversation, and it's been wonderful. But is there anything else you'd like to say by way of conclusion, John?
I want to say thank you. And Joe, I wanted to say thank you. I've just loved this, our conversation, and the way in which we've been able to talk with the participants about their questions and their ideas. I thought this really, it was very happy making for me. I mean, I've been soaked in this since July, so it's great to see it all coming together. And Michael Scott, thank you for making the platform where we could have this conversation.
All right. Well, thank you, John. And I hand it over now to Michael Scott to take us home.
Okay.
Well, thank you both. It's been a fascinating session, and really thank you, John, because you got me to go and read the poem and Easter Day actually. What I found was that I've got to go back and read it again and again. Somebody wrote to me last night and said they were just going to start reading it, and it seemed to be a very long poem. And I thought it was going to be a long night for you. Anyway, but it is a very complex poem, and you've helped make it so attractive to us and so intelligible to us. So thank you very much for such an enjoyable event, and thank you, Joe, for the way that you've handled that discussion. Our next event in this series will be next Tuesday on the 23rd of November, when Charles Tongue will be discussing H.G. Wells again with Joe Simmons. And coming up are Julia Lamb speaking on Julian of Norwich. That'll be on the 7th of December. And then straight after after Christmas on January the 18th, Barbara Majewski will be talking about Teresa of Avila. There are two further events which you might like to note before Christmas. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future of the Humanities Project will be on Monday, the 13th of December at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. BST, when we will be discussing issues relating to climate change. And this will feature Layla Moran. She is from the UK Parliament and a leading member of the Liberal Democratic Party. So I'm delighted that she's agreed to speak. There will be other speakers as well, and there will be a Zoom in our China series on Friday, the 3rd of December, when Alexa Alice Jobin from George Washington University, Washington DC, just down the road from Georgetown, of course, will be discussing Asian embodiment of a white canon, Shakespeare and the Sinophone world. There's another great lecture or talk in the future there. But please note a time change, as this talk will take place at 1:30 EST in the USA. That's 6:30 p.m. in the UK, and that's because Alexa is actually lecturing, would you believe, that morning. So she's had to push it back, and is rushing from a lecture to give us her talk on Shakespeare in China and the Chinese world. Fascinating. At 1:30 EST. Joe and I would like to thank those at Georgetown University who've made today's event happen, especially our administrators, Amy van der Vliet and Mary Gordon, and they make the Zoom presentations possible. Our special thanks, as ever, to Catherine Temple, who behind the scenes takes in the questions and feeds them to Joe or to me when I'm in the chair. Further thanks at Georgetown to Jack DeJoya, the president, and Tom Banchoff, the vice president, Global Affairs. At Campion Hall, Oxford, to Dr. Nick Austin, the master of Campion Hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Campion Hall administrators. At Blackfriars, to Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, and John O'Connor, the regent, and to Kinga Rona Gabnai. My thanks also to Maggie Scott, and of course, again to John Fordresher and for Joe Simmons, who have helped so much today and have given us such a terrific discussion. Finally, our thanks to you for being part of the audience. Please join us again for some of the events that are outlined. In the meantime, take care, keep safe. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter @MikeScottProf. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all. Goodbye.